Assalamu alaikum. So this is part of the case bundle number 7. We already discussed Cisco's implementation of ERP. This is a different company called Vandelay Industries, and this is also an implementation of an ERP case study. Now let's start with the synopsis of the overall case. So Vandelay Industries is actually a company that wanted to implement in ERP, and they wanted to go for a comprehensive implementation of an ERP because it's a manufacturing company that has a lot of competition from overseas rivals. It's an $8 billion manufacturing company, and Elaine Kramer, who's a consultant with the Deloitte and Touche consulting groups, was going to be leading this entire implementation project. Now, Vandelay had selected the R3 software by SAP AG to be precise. As I mentioned in the earlier discussion, SAP is the world leader when it comes to ERP systems, or followed by Oracle, followed by Microsoft now. So currently the SAP's ERP version is S4, but the one that we are referring to in this case is R3. Now they had planned to install this at all 14 of their facilities, this new ERP, and R3 was going to replace this hodgepodge system of multiple different systems that they had that was handling their manufacturing and their order fulfillment before this happened. Now they did not operate very effectively and they were not integrated. So R3 was going to be a single company-wide implementation that would have catered for all the company's accounting and financial information, the manufacturing resource planning and materials resource planning, the materials management, order fulfillment, and all other information related tasks that were enterprise-wide. Vandelay had hired Deloitte as their consultants, not only to assist with the technical details of installing and implementing R3, but also to guide this entire process of organizational and operational change that would happen during this ERP implementation. SAP, Deloitte, and their client all believed that there were a lot of benefits with R3, but most of the results would actually come from adhering to these new business practices. That's the best practices based on which this ERP was made. Vandelay wanted to standardize on these best practices and make sure that they were implemented throughout all of their 14 business sites. And ICS Deloitte's main task was to actually work with the project teams to define them and put them into place. Elaine Kramer would be responsible for leading this effort, which had been budgeted to be around $20 million. Now Kramer and Deloitte, their consultants, made use of what they termed as technology-enabled business process redesign, which was a method of defining all of these new operational practices that they took into account, that also took into account the capabilities of the software and how they'll be used. So basically they were changing their business practices according to the system and the system's capabilities. The consultants felt that this would get more results more reliably than having a clean sheet redesign effort. So what they were doing was they were looking at which parts of the software would handle and be corresponding to what kind of business practices that they had. Kramer prepared the entire redesign effort that they would be going ahead with and changing, and she knew that there would be a lot of tensions that would happen during the implementation team and the autonomous plants, because the 14 sites had a lot of autonomy beforehand, before all of this implementation had happened, with respect to the kind of systems that they used and the way they used them. So she realized that this standardization process would be pretty resisted to by these 14 sites. Now the entire purpose of this particular case is to make the students understand that it actually is a dilemma. It's a dilemma related to the training during Vandelay's R3 implementation system. The plant manager is eager to get his people trained so that they can actually go ahead and change the system once it's implemented. Now Kramer knows that the individual sites will not be free to make the changes. One of the most heavily touted benefits of SAP is that it is actually a standardization based system. It's all about standardization. It's about making the entire organization use the same kind of system. This training issue is where the beginning starts. So students must first understand what ERP systems are. Now R3 and all of its similar systems are going and being implemented in large organizations and enterprises, and many managers actually face the decision about implementing or not implementing the system, as was the case with Cisco. The case explains the basics of ERP operation, which you've already read, I'm pretty sure, and it talks about the various terminologies that are used for it and why ERP is growing up. So you need to look at that obviously and understand its implementation. I've already recommended that you should go and read the ABCs of ERP, which is a seminal article published in around 2002 in the CIO magazine, and it's in your Drawbacks folder. So discussing the difference between IT-led improvement and improvement-led IT. Now this goes and harkens back and connects to the point that we discussed way back in our first case bundle, which is about if you have too much IT and not enough IT. That's essentially what it says. Whether or not you bring in a change because it was led by the IT, or would you implement an improvement that is supported by IT? Two different things. So you students need to understand the difference between these two very important elements and the benefits and drawbacks of each of these approaches. The case actually contrasts these two approaches for business process reengineering, which Deloitte calls technology enabled, PPR, and it starts by assuming that the installation of a particular ERP system, and one of which and the other approach is to have a clean sheet, right? So the debate is about the advantage and disadvantage of both, and we'll discuss them. This case also is supposed to teach people about the impact and how IT can impact learning and innovation. One of the promises of ERP is to standardize everything, but this can actually be a double-edged sword, because SAP installations and implementations is like putting in liquid concrete, and it just solidifies everything. So this explicitly is this is not a philosophy that will support continuous improvement or learning. So that's also a point. How much would you change these standard practices and make them even better? Or should you just stick with what they are and never think about improving yourself? That's also something that this case talks about how standardization can be the exact antithesis or opposite of continuous improvement. So to reveal another aspect of this case is to reveal whether firm level and industry level issues are present and how they are present with respect to ERP usages. So is ERP actually really necessary for organization? What is going to happen with it? Does it really work out? So what are external competitive needs, if any, does ERP actually satisfy? It does, but we're going to look at that. So is it really necessary because the entire industry wants it? And if all major competitors in the industry are implementing R3 and using the best practices, then can ERP system actually give you any competitive advantage? So if everybody has it, it loses its competitive advantage, doesn't it? So is that the case? It becomes what is referred to as infrastructural technology. So let's look at different components of this entire analysis. I'll break it down into 4 different sections. Let's talk about the technical aspects of ERPs and R3s for managers. Now, what are the advantages of R3? Let's look at that. The R3 has been adopted since 1992. It is because the system actually gives a lot of advantages over other IT solutions that are providing almost or trying to provide the same thing. Before ERP was available, most organizations would have different systems for different purposes. Production was handled with a different system, accounting with a different system, order fulfillment with a different system, important tasks with a different system. So maintenance and troubleshooting was very time consuming because things weren't integrated and they weren't working in the same way. So R3 actually uses desktop machines, regular computers, and client server architecture, which means these computers are connected to a main server over the network. So companies already had them in the 90s, so it was not necessary to have this mainframe terminal system that was present earlier on. Furthermore, R3's data was stored in a single fully integrated database. That does not mean it's all in one place. It means that it's all integrated and you're given access to your required areas of information. This meant that communication among different departments and different functional systems was not an issue anymore, and there were no double entries of data. There was no data redundancy, and there was a very solid data consistency and integrity, which means that data in one system or in one department was the same as the other. There was no mismatch of information between, say, manufacturing and finance and manufacturing and marketing. So that was no longer a problem, and wouldn't have been a problem if you get R3. So the single database made getting data out of it and reporting far more flexible, far more easier, far more accurate. The R3 modules could interact with each other in real time, which meant that all these departments and all the components of these would work as a single system, integrated solution. Even though they were different systems, different programs, they were still working together. The interface was the same, and that made it a lot more efficient. So that is why R3 was better as well. R3 also presented the same user interface, which meant the same look and feel, which meant that people working on it would find it easier to adapt if they were moved from one department to another. If they were rotated in their jobs. The software was also oriented around processes instead of functions. A process is a series of functions that are interconnected that result in the same value chain. So this is why it was very important. So a business process cuts through many functional areas. Functional areas are like marketing, management, or production and manufacturing and order processing, while a process would be, say, receiving an order and then it going through all of those departments, all of those functional areas until its fulfillment. So before this, ERP systems would be more functional in their approaches, which is what we discussed. discussed in the beginning of this course. But an ERP is more process oriented. It is technically process oriented. Because it used common hardware, software, database interfaces, a company using R3 did not have to worry about learning new things or new systems or making them work with each other. It was all the same, so it could work. SAP also offered a one-stop shopping for most of their IT functionality the customers needed, so they had everything. As I said, SAP is the world leader when it comes to ERPs. It still is even today. So for additional discussion, let's look at the other elements, which is to understand the drawbacks of R3. So despite these advantages, R3 was not like the end-all technical solution. The system had drawbacks that we need to be discussed. R3 was inward-facing. It was intended to be used within an organization. There was less collaborative capability where it would allow it to be working with other organizations easily. However, today's SAP S4 is capable of this far more. Secondly, the system was made using a closed source programming language and standard, which was only used by SAP for their SAP development, which was ABAP 4, and that's why it was very difficult to modify or extend it, and there were very few programmers. Unlike, say, if the company SAP had chosen C or C++ or some other language which was more commonly used by people, there would have been more programmers and more people working on it, more people who could modify it. So this was a disadvantage. So changes would take longer because finding the technical HR for it would be harder. R3 was introduced before different internet related tools came up, so it wasn't very capable of connecting with other systems, and especially with e-commerce. Again, I would point out this is a 1992 late 90s case, so this was the case back then. It is no longer the case now. The software assumes a push-based model of production, which means that the features are based more on the push model of doing production instead of the pull-based one, which is, say, for instance, just in time. So it was it could not handle that. So if it any organization that was using Toyota's GIT system would probably have to find a different solution rather than the R3 from SAP. So configuration via switch setting, which means that it would require a little while for you to set up the ERP, but that is always the case, but that was an issue. You had to set up the entire ERP according to your organization's needs. Many companies and studies have found that the client-server computing is actually more expensive than the mainframe. Again, this was the case earlier on. That is no longer the case now. Now with the advent of cloud computing, client-server is the future, and it is the present as well. So project management consideration. These were the drawbacks. Now let's look at the project management consideration for Deloitte and Vandelay. Deloitte, again, to remind you, is the consultant that Vandelay was using to get this app implementation. So using and having consultants. Most companies like Vandelay always get good consultants, and that is crucial. So they had consultants that were helping them with their ERP implementation. There were two reasons. First, the processing of the installation of R3, and second, configuring it and converting it from the previous system is a very complicated process, requires a lot of technical expertise. So SAP specialists, or jockeys as they're called, were essential for this purpose, and they were very useful for these activities. So it goes without saying that having any such implementation would require these SAP specialists, because they understand such projects. So those at Deloitte were very useful for this purpose. Second, firms typically use ERP implementation as a major change step. What they do is, whenever they want to make major changes to their organization, and they also want to implement an ERP, they use this incident or this time to actually do that. So they did that. They actually made major changes, and we will discuss them in a while, where we'll talk about the comparison of a different way of doing things, either technology-driven re-engineering or clean sheet implementations. So ERP has become the environment in which a lot of companies go through this whole re-engineering process, or business process re-engineering. So this field has been very fertile and very important for consulting for many years, and that's what this case also has as an example. The case also talks about another issue, which is the use of consultants, which says that that was very interesting. It was that it states that over 50% of Deloitte's professionals had more than 2 years of experience with SAP products. This means, of course, that about half of them had even less experience, but that is because ERP systems like R3 were very new back in the day. So finding qualified consultants was very difficult back then, and there were far too few as compared to the demand for them. So this is no longer the case. Now we have enough consultants. However, implementation like Vandelay is how they would learn, and that's why it was important. Remember that a similar idea was discussed in Cisco, where it talked about hungry vendors and consultants. So yeah, those companies wanted to learn implementing ERPs so they could gain experience and eventually do it in other organizations, which is what happened. So Vandelay, Cisco, these companies were the pioneers or the people or the organizations that were the first ones to have ERPs implemented. Now let's also talk about project budget and overruns. The case also talks about the estimates of the time and effort required for Vandelay's ERP implementation, and it was quite a difficult process where the calculations were done, and yet it did overrun. So the full project was about for 20 million, which include the trainers' salaries, the trainers who were training the users to use the new system, and the various effort that was put in by the Vandelay employees at any given time, the new hardware that they got, the new networking, the software cost, which included the licensing costs, so several amounts. So if you were to break it down, it was quite a bit. The total project time frame was about 18 months, which was about 1.5 years. The full-time team membership was about 50 people, 20 Vandelay's people, and about 30 consultants. The total number of Vandelay employees that required R3 training was about 13,000. That's about 2/3 of the 20,000 total number of employees. The assumption was that the average training time for the employees would require about 2.5 days, which is about 20 hours or in total. And average consulting bill would be $150 per hour, which amounts to about $300,000 per year. The average Vandelay employee salary was about $60,000 per year. So the total consulting fees was about 13.5 million. The total salary expenses were about 1.8 million. The total salary expense for employees during the training was about 7.8 million. So the total expense of total consulting and salary alone was 23.1 million. So obviously this does not include everything, but this just tells you how ERP implementations can almost always overrun the expected cost. So their total budget was 20 million, while they exceeded it by 3.1 million US dollars. The same as Cisco, but in Cisco's case they had overrun it by about 122%. That was quite a bit. Now let's discuss clean sheet versus the technology enabled reengineering idea. Let's discuss that. So let us look at this idea of clean sheet versus technology enabled reengineering. Reengineering is a popular term. The whole idea is that it's all about organizational change. It's about bringing in a change in the organization about the way that they're doing their work, all of their work. Sometimes it accompanies a technological change in the information system. Sometimes it's just a change that happens in the way that the process is happening. You basically go ahead and remove any steps, any processes that are not adding value to the value chain itself. So that's what reengineering is all about. So technology enabled change that Deloitte and Vandelay actually did has greater success than the usual clean sheet reengineering. Now there are three important issues that we need to understand in order to understand the difference between the two, which is to determine whether technology enabled change is in fact an improvement and to see whether it will make a difference in Vandelay's case. Now I will make a comparison in the two in between these two methodologies. Now if you look at the clean sheet side, it is a no blinders from any software. The idea is that one of the advantages of going with clean sheet is you're not predetermined or pre-biased towards a particular software technology. There is a potential for bringing in new process because you're not hung up on having a particular software. The technology enabled one, however, it's unique. The radical processes will not change, and the process is based on the best practices. So when you do a technology enabled one, you're basically focusing on a software that will bring in and help you bring in the change. But in this case, that software was the ERP and the most leading ERP of all. So it will bring in the best practices. So comparing with the clean sheet, again, the clean sheet is not hung up on the software. So you have an advantage there because you could bring in new processes. But on the other hand, a technology enabled reengineering change would not be stuck up with the software, which will be linked to a software, and that software will be the best practices one. Now on the clean sheet side, the process design is a lot quicker because you're starting from scratch. But in the case of a technology enabled one, the process design can take more time because the software capabilities have to be taken into account to create the process design according to that. So in the clean sheet case, since you're developing the process design as you go, you're not limited. But in the technology enabled one, you're limited based on the software that you're implementing, right? Another thing that needs to be taken into account is the fact that when you look at the clean sheet methodology, in the clean sheet methodology, we need to look at the fact that the software search process takes time. It takes a lot of time to actually find the right kind of software. And therefore, because of that, it may actually be a longer process. So clean sheet will require you to look for the software that will fulfill your requirements, then the vendor that are providing those softwares. Huge task. Looking at the technology enabled side, the software selection is already done in advance, so you don't need to worry about it. Let's look at the clean sheets next aspect. Potentially extensive software rewrites are required because you need to change the software quite a bit, which will cost a lot of money to actually get it to work with your own chosen process design. But on the technology enabled side, that's not the case because you've already looked at the software capabilities during the process design process, therefore the modification is not required. And lastly, for the clean sheet side, no guarantee that the processes will actually be achievable. You have written them down, but actually getting them working is very difficult. But on the technology enabled side, the resulting processes are technically achievable because the softwares have already proven that they are. So this is a nice comparison. So the most important question is whether the advantages of a technology enabled change have a larger impact on large organizational improvement efforts like Vandelay's. So will ERP systems actually allow firms to re-engineer themselves? So this question is at the heart of this entire case. This is what we're discussing. So Vandelay is planning to devote a lot of resources to R3. So will it actually be a wise investment or not? So the answer of this question does not lie in whether or not re-engineering method is used is technology enabled or not, but in the concept of actually improving the operation through the implementation of these best practices, because that's the key of this. So let's explore these two aspects next. Okay, so let's look at these two different approaches now. Now, approaches to process standardization compared and to best practices. Now, Kramer's first dilemma was that she prepared to lead Vandelay's engagement with the plant managers. She had to request for early training into R3 so that the people who wanted to modify the software or tinker with it, change with it, experiment with it could do it and suit their needs. She felt, however, that one of the greatest benefits of SAP's implementation was the standardization around those best practices. So she wanted all the 14 places to have the same level and the same kind of software implementation. Both SAP and Deloitte actually bring suites of these practices to each of their clients. Now SAP are built into the R3 software. These best practices of theirs are built into it. We've already discussed those advantages. Each of these can be executed in different ways, but basically they're the same. So while they're developed with the help of the project team and taking into account that the client has unique circumstances, the best practices are intended to standardize as much as possible all of those internal processes. ERP implementations go with the assumption that it's all about standardization, and the standardization based on the best practices. What clients can get with R3 is this whole bundle of best practices. With this model in mind for installing and using R3, a consultant would be very hesitant about allowing any kind of tinkering because they wouldn't really support this kind of changes in the system. And any tampering, because these practices would then be ruined. The whole point would be destroyed. So in the case, however, Kramer was aware that total process standardization would be unlikely because Vandelay actually had a long tradition of giving autonomy to their people, to their organizations managers, different branches managers, and that's why she must decide then whether or not to enforce these standard processes and allow some variation. So some possible ground rules had to be established, and those were the two standard, and they were like she could standardize only the process that created the database entries. In other words, only the processes that were making major changes to the main database that everybody was accessing, only standardize those and make sure that nobody messes with those. Or secondly, to ensure that all external interfaces where Vandelay was communicating with their customers, suppliers, etc., all their partners are all standardized. In other words, all the outward facing systems are standardized, and to ensure that another way would be to ensure that both internal and external interfaces are as consistent as possible, as similar and as standardized as possible. So not just only the processes that involve another firm, but also that involve more than one Vandelay site. So if site A is talking to site B, those two must be using the exact same kind of software, the same standardized softwares. In this scenario, only processes that were completely and only internal to a particular site out of those 14 sites could be allowed to be modified, nothing else. And to standardize as many best practices as possible, and do not allow sites to make any changes, and only allow any kind of changes in the R3 process that are considered to be less important to the core work of the business, and attempt to create as much uniformity as possible. So these were the possibilities of the ground rules that she could have. So best practices, re-engineering, and continuous improvement. Now let's compare these three things. As I said earlier on, that if you're going to implement a best practices system, there is no element of continuous improvement possible. So regardless of the level of process of standardization desired, most of the Vandelay project will consist of implementing operations and these operational practices. The goal of the effort would be to get these to run smoothly. In this sense, technology-enabled change is no different from a clean sheet one, because it's all about business process re-engineering. They both attempt to move the organization from one set of methods or methodologies or processes to another one. When we see it this way, engineering around best practices has a lot of shortcomings as a strategy for operational improvement, because it's all about implementing what is already there. So it is not explicitly not a continuous improvement, but the point is, when you make best practices already standardized and you say this is the best, there is no room for improvement. So even if an organization establishes a program of constantly reviewing and making them changes, the improvement under these re-engineering does not come from continuous learning and refinement. It would be discrete jumps and changes that would happen, but in most cases that won't be the case, because the processes and operations may learn from it, but since the software doesn't support it, it won't really work out. So, and an over reliance on best practices meant that not only do these improvements come from these jumps that you will make into a new system, but they also come from outside the operation, from other than the the process itself. So even though Vandelay's project team will include people from different sites, most employees will have no influence directly on the changes that are being made to their jobs. So Kramer in the case says that she has a preference for input by many and design by a few. So she gets information from everybody, learns from everybody, but consults very specific group of people for the actual design. So many people will be very unhappy with this loss of control, but that is how it is, and re-engineering is thus a very questionable improvement strategy for another reason, which is that it ignores the fact that people are often the best source of knowledge. So you're ignoring that too. Number 4, competitive implications of technology enabled change. So a final consideration around the whole Vandelay thing is that R3 implementation and the use of these technologies, whether or not this would give you competitive advantages compared to your rivals, and if everybody uses this, then does it really give you that competitive advantage or not? Now, the case states that Vandelay's foreign competitors were using simpler system, simpler, more elegant system, which had less expense. The machines were cheaper. They had shorter lead times than their American counterpart, which was Vandelay. Now, Vandelay responded by introducing lower price models, but it appears that the firm still needed to produce them far more quickly. So the ERP will be able to help with this, because it is all about improving efficiencies. It's all about speeding up the process. So to the extent that R3 can eliminate any kind of incompatibilities between different systems, which will then reduce the overall lead time, which will make it more efficient, it will have a positive impact on the lead time. So similarly, these best practices that Deloitte and Vandelay were developing together would actually improve the efficiency of their work. So these improvements are likely going to help Vandelay gain a lot of ground on its rivals and give the firm an edge in many areas. However, there's an important question whether these advantages will be sustainable in the future as well. Will they continue? Whether or not, because obviously other companies will get these kind of systems as well. So after the implementation, their practices would be very similar to Vandelay as well, those other companies. So does this mean then that none of these practices can differentiate a firm or provide the basis for sustainable competitive advantage? If everybody has them, it has no meaning then. So in this scenario, no operations practice controlled by the ERP system, no aspect of order fulfillment or production or control or procurement can be exploited by any company, because all practices will become identical. ERP software is then not actually a source of advantage, but rather a competitive leveler. So in other words, it will not give you sustainable competitive advantage. It will actually make you equal to them or close to them. What you will then need to do in order to become sustainably competitive, have sustainable competitive advantage, is to look elsewhere, look for other avenues, other places. In other words, what we studied in the first case bundle stands true, that software must not be considered a source of sustainable competitive advantage, because what is proprietary software today becomes infrastructure software tomorrow, and everybody has it and it loses its sustainable value. Recall the VRIN model that we discussed in the very first week and the first classes. The previous two sections I've already talked about. If Vandelay concentrates too heavily on setting up universal standards and best practices through the help of Deloitte and R3, and it will run into several risks, which is that these best practices will not let you learn or improve anymore, which would be a huge disadvantage, and they have to keep on learning. And secondly, they also need to look at that the advantages that they will get from this software must come from their actual operations, from the way that they leverage different other advantages. The two possibilities lead to the conclusion that Vandelay should adopt one of the less less comprehensive programs that we talked about, approaches to the process standardization, where I was talking about how to standardize and which parts to standardize and which to allow to be changed in order to bring it along. So it probably makes sense to standardize all data formats throughout the entire firm, all 14 sites, and the uniform best practices. However, having all the sites use the same kind of practices wouldn't be such a great idea. That's what I would look at. Now let's look at some questions that are related to the case. So there are reasons for the success of ERPs and R3s. One of the major reasons is because of the discussion that we already had about the advantages of R3 and similar ERP systems. And in the case of Vandelay, although it doesn't really give them a competitive sustainable advantage, but it still gives them the equalizing effect that is necessary, considering that all other companies in the same industry are going for ERPs. Another angle is the project management issues that Deloitte and Vandelay had. The reasons for the enthusiasm of ERP has already been talked about, right? So Vandelay and Deloitte have structured their implementation effort very well. They're very aggressive. They were very budget controlling. They made sure that even though it overran the budget, it wasn't by too much. So they managed it really well. So that was an important aspect. However, they also appreciated and understood the drawbacks of R3. Then the degrees of process standardization and their implications. They understood that they could not really have complete and absolute standardization. They had to give some level of autonomy to those different sites, because that was essential, because that was a tradition that they had. So they must give them that level of freedom, and it wasn't going to be completely standardized. So they made sure that only the bare minimum of things were allowed to be changed, but still you had to give them that kind of freedom. So whether or not standardizing all practices is a good idea, no, not really. And it was supposed to be a technology-led improvement, not an improvement-led technology. The pros and cons of the two re-engineering approaches, we've discussed them in detail about how each one of them, the clean sheet versus the technology-enabled re-engineering, makes sense. So it depends completely on the business. So usually the idea is better that technology should follow the business instead of leading it. However, it is still something that you have to look at in the other direction as well. So it's not like the two are different from each other, but yes, it should always be the business requirements that are guided by technology, not the other way around. So re-engineering ERP and improvement paths. Again, re-engineering is a brilliant idea that needs to be done, and but you need to also understand that alone is not going to give you the long-term advantages. Best practices often hold back a company, because implementation of best practices through re-engineering may not let you have continuous improvement. So that also needs to be taken into account. The competitive consequences of ERPs are that you won't immediately get an advantage out of it. You will get the performance dip that is going to happen, but it will give you long-term advantages, because it will give you that leg up. Especially in the case of Vandelay, it gave them a leg up in the marketplace because it was making them more efficient. So that's pretty much it for this case.